Imagine a world where emperors slept with their sisters, nobles staged orgies with hundreds of guests, and a simple dinner could end in a night of unimaginable depravity. Welcome to the Roman Empire, where power wasn't just measured in battles or politics, but also in the bedchamber. What you're about to hear are the most disturbing, bizarre, and almost unbelievable sexual practices that fueled the darkest desires of ancient Rome. Stay with me, because number 10 will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about history. This is Royal Conspiracies, where hidden truths and shocking history come alive. If you love untold stories like this, make sure to subscribe, like, and share, because we're just getting started. Religion in ancient Rome was never separate from daily life. Every decision, from harvest to war, was thought to be influenced by the gods. But unlike later Christian morality, Roman religion was not bound by chastity or sexual shame. In fact, in many places, sex itself was seen as a direct pathway to the divine. At temples dedicated to Venus, the goddess of love, or her eastern counterpart, Ishtar, worshippers could pay not just for prayer but for intimacy. Historians call this sacred prostitution, an act where women and sometimes men served as vessels of the goddess. A man who lay with such a priestess was not thought to be committing a sin. Instead, he was believed to be blessed, receiving favor from Venus herself. Imagine stepping into one of these temples, the air heavy with incense, marble statues of the goddess glowing in torchlight, and priestesses adorned not in modest robes but in sheer fabrics meant to entice. A worshipper placed a coin at the altar, whispered his prayer, and then was led into a private chamber where his prayer was answered through flesh. Romans believed this sacred union purified both body and soul. For widows or infertile couples, such acts were thought to improve fertility. For soldiers, it brought courage before battle. And for the lonely, it gave a taste of the divine, an experience no less holy than receiving communion centuries later. But to outsiders, especially conservative Greek philosophers or later Christian writers, this was unthinkable. To them, Rome was desecrating the sacred. Yet for the Romans, the body and spirit were inseparable. To please Venus, you didn't kneel, you embraced. This practice reveals a shocking truth. For Rome, sex was not merely private indulgence. It was a public act of worship, written into the very calendar of festivals. It was both spiritual duty and carnal pleasure, a merging of heaven and earth in the most intimate of ways. If sacred prostitution blurred the line between religion and sex, Roman banquets erased the line between celebration and debauchery. For the Roman elite, parties were not just meals. They were performances of wealth, decadence, and desire. Picture this: a grand villa on the Palatine Hill. Marble floors polished, fountains spraying perfumed water, couches arranged around a vast dining hall. Guests reclined, sipping wine sweetened with honey, while slaves moved silently between them carrying trays of roasted boar, stuffed dormice, and exotic fruits from Africa. But as the night deepened, the atmosphere shifted. Dancers entered, first clothed, then gradually shedding garments. Music grew louder, wine flowed endlessly, and inhibitions collapsed. Senators, merchants, even noblewomen mingled in shadowed corners where hands roamed freely. Soon the feast transformed into what Romans themselves called a convivium, a living together. But to us, it was an orgy. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, of men and women intermingled in wild abandon. For the host, this wasn't just pleasure, it was power. To invite someone to your orgy was to pull them into your confidence, bind them with secrecy, or humiliate them into loyalty. The most infamous hosts were emperors themselves. Nero, for example, was said to hold parties that blurred into week-long festivals of excess, with entire gardens converted into sexual playgrounds. Suetonius, a Roman historian, describes these gatherings where every appetite, food, drink, flesh, was sated without restraint. And it wasn't always consensual. Slaves were expected to perform, whether they wished to or not. Noble women risked scandal if caught, yet many participated willingly, drawn by the thrill of forbidden pleasure. Some even disguised themselves in masks to indulge without recognition. But perhaps the strangest detail was how normalized it was among the upper class. A Roman general could command an army by day and by night recline with his rivals at the same banquet table, their alliances sealed not with contracts but with shared bodies. For Rome, an orgy wasn't simply indulgence. It was politics, theater, and domination rolled into one. And in a society where reputation was everything, rumors of one's behavior at such feasts could destroy or cement a career. The Roman banquet was therefore more than a party. It was a stage where Rome's elite acted out their ambitions, their lusts, and their darkest fantasies under flickering lamplight. The Romans had a phrase, quod licet Iovi non licet bovi. What is permitted to Jupiter is not permitted to an ox. In other words, the powerful lived by different rules. Nowhere was this more visible than in the sex lives of Rome's emperors. The most shocking example is Caligula. Historians claim he not only flaunted mistresses and lovers in public, but he also openly slept with his own sisters, Agrippina the Younger, Drusilla, and Livilla. At banquets, he would call them from their seats, disappear behind curtains, and return moments later as if nothing unusual had happened. To Rome's senatorial elite, this was monstrous. Yet no one dared object. Caligula was emperor. His whims carried the force of law. His obsession with his sister Drusilla was particularly notorious. When she died young, Caligula declared her a goddess, ordering public mourning as if the empire had lost its queen. Whispers spread that his grief was not just brotherly, but the grief of a man who had lost his closest lover. Other emperors, too, indulged in forbidden passions. Nero married 2 men in full public ceremonies, sometimes playing the role of bride himself. Claudius, more subtle but equally scandalous, married his own niece Agrippina, both shocking and politically strategic. These unions blurred every line between love and power, family and desire, morality and madness. To the Roman people, rumors of imperial lust were both terrifying and enthralling. After all, if the emperor could break the holiest taboos and survive, what did that say about the empire itself? The forbidden loves of Rome's emperors remind us that in a society where absolute power rested in one man's hands, sexual boundaries were not rules to follow. They were toys to break. In the Colosseum, gladiators fought for their lives. But beyond blood and sand, they became icons of irresistible desire. To Roman women, these fighters represented everything forbidden: danger, virility, raw power. Graffiti carved on walls reveals noble women writing about their favorite gladiators, often in language shockingly explicit for the time. One inscription praises a fighter as the heartthrob of the girls, the delight of women. But desire was not limited to admiration. Wealthy women, even wives of senators, arranged secret trysts with gladiators. Ancient sources describe women bribing guards to sneak into gladiators' barracks or disguising themselves to meet them after fights. For these women, seducing a gladiator was both rebellion and thrill, a chance to embrace the dangerous underworld hidden behind Rome's polished marble. This obsession sometimes turned tragic. In Pompeii, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a noblewoman and her gladiator lover, buried together during the eruption of Vesuvius. Evidence that passion crossed class lines despite scandal. Men, too, idolized gladiators. Some sought to copy their physique, others their notoriety. And for emperors, owning a famous gladiator meant owning not just a fighter but a symbol of public lust. The gladiator was both a slave and a superstar, despised and adored. He risked his life in the arena by day, and by night, he risked scandal in the arms of Rome's most powerful women. This paradox, shame and worship, lust and violence, made gladiators one of Rome's strangest sexual obsessions. One of the darkest practices of Rome was infibulation, a brutal method of sexual control. Slaves, prostitutes, and sometimes even free performers were forced into it. Infibulation meant binding or locking the genitals with a clasp or ring, preventing intercourse until the master or owner permitted it. For men, a metal or leather band would pierce the foreskin, locking it shut. For women, straps or stitched bindings ensured chastity. It was a physical cage for desire. Why did Romans do this? For profit and power. A slave who could not engage in unauthorized sex was considered preserved and more valuable. Female slaves kept untouched fetched higher prices in the markets. Male singers or actors were locked to protect their voices, since Romans believed sexual activity weakened a performer's strength. The cruelty was staggering. Imagine being a young slave, chained not just in body but in your very intimacy, forced to carry a lock that only your master could open. Pleasure was stripped away, replaced by humiliation and pain. Even in Rome's own time, some writers criticized the practice. Yet it continued for centuries, a reminder that for many in Rome, sex was not freedom but ownership. Infibulation turned the human body into property, and desire into something that could be padlocked and sold. When we think of Roman feasts, images of endless food and flowing wine come to mind. But the reality was far darker. For the Roman elite, a banquet was not just dining, it was a descent into excess. Contrary to popular myth, a vomitorium was not a special room for vomiting. It was the name for exit passages in amphitheaters. But wealthy Romans did deliberately induce vomiting during feasts. Why? So they could keep eating and drinking, extending the night of indulgence. Food was only the beginning. After hours of feasting, when bellies were full and inhibitions drowned in wine, the banquet shifted into a stage for desire. Nude dancers performed acrobatic routines, musicians played suggestive tunes, and slaves, male and female, were ordered to entertain guests in far more intimate ways. Some banquets ended with orgies, others with shocking performances where men and women enacted explicit myths before the crowd. The line between feast and sexual theater blurred until they were inseparable. For emperors like Elagabalus, excess knew no limits. He famously served dishes of flamingo tongues and camel heels, followed by nights where he demanded his guests participate in sexual games. The banquet became a weapon of dominance, forcing senators and generals into humiliating spectacles of submission. To the outside world, Rome was the pinnacle of civilization. But inside its villas, beneath the glitter of gold and marble, banquets revealed the empire's darkest appetite. A hunger not just for food and drink, but for endless, unrestrained pleasure. No matter the cost, Rome was a city of festivals. Nearly every month, the calendar marked days dedicated to gods, heroes, or seasonal changes. But among them, the most controversial were the fertility festivals, events where sexual freedom was not only tolerated but celebrated in the open streets. One of the most infamous was Floralia, honoring the goddess Flora, protector of flowers and fertility. Unlike solemn religious rites, Floralia was wild, colorful, and scandalous. Prostitutes were invited to perform nude dances in public theaters. Men shouted vulgar jokes without fear of punishment. Some even engaged in explicit acts before cheering crowds because for one night, morality was suspended. The idea was simple. By indulging in sexual openness, Romans believed they pleased the goddess, ensuring fertile crops, healthy children, and prosperity. To refuse to join in was almost seen as insulting the gods themselves. Another notorious festival was Lupercalia, held in mid-February. Priests of the cult of Lupercus would sacrifice goats, strip off their skins, and run through the streets naked, striking women with strips of hide. Far from being offensive, women welcomed it, believing the touch increased their fertility and guaranteed safe childbirth. Imagine the spectacle. Senators, matrons, and slaves alike, laughing as half-naked priests sprinted through Rome, whipping anyone in their path, while crowds roared approval. It was chaotic, primal, and utterly Roman. To us, these festivals seem shocking. But for Romans, they were communal therapy, moments where the strict hierarchies of daily life collapsed. The noble and the poor, the virgin and the prostitute, all shared in ritualized chaos. Sex was not hidden in shadows but celebrated under the sun. Woven into the very rhythm of Roman religion, marriage in Rome was never about romance. It was about politics, property, and power. Families arranged unions to secure alliances, pass down wealth, or strengthen social standing. But in their relentless pursuit of advantage, Romans sometimes crossed lines that horrify us today. One such practice was incestuous marriage among the elite. Though technically frowned upon, the law was elastic when emperors or powerful senators were involved. Emperor Claudius married his own niece, Agrippina the Younger, mother of Nero. It was scandalous, but the Senate, fearful of opposing him, declared it legal. Why risk such outrage? Because incest preserved power within the family. By marrying close relatives, noble houses ensured their fortune and influence stayed intact. To them, bloodlines were more important than morality. But this wasn't limited to the palace. In some regions of the empire, particularly Egypt, sibling marriage became surprisingly common. Census records from Roman Egypt show a shocking number of brothers marrying sisters, sometimes as much as 20% of recorded unions in certain towns. Whether this was cultural carryover from earlier traditions or a Roman adaptation, it shows how far marriage could drift from our modern idea of love. Even laws meant to enforce morality often had loopholes. For example, adultery was technically punishable by exile. Yet emperors like Augustus used these laws selectively, punishing rivals while ignoring their own dalliances. Roman society functioned on a strange double standard: rigid moral codes for the weak, but boundless indulgence for the powerful. So while Rome preached order and tradition, in practice, marriage was often a tool of manipulation. Bending even the most sacred taboos in the name of ambition, Rome was the empire of conquest, and with every conquest came new temptations. Exotic foods, perfumes, spices, and, inevitably, pleasures from foreign lands. Romans prided themselves on novelty, always searching for the next indulgence to shock the senses. Foreign courtesans from Greece, Egypt, and the East were in high demand, famed for their beauty and mysterious allure. Some were trained in erotic dances, others in whispered arts of seduction that Romans considered strange and thrilling. Owning or being entertained by such companions was a status symbol, proof that you had the wealth to command pleasures from across the known world. But it wasn't just foreign bodies they desired, it was also strange potions and rituals. Aphrodisiacs were wildly popular. Some were harmless, like herbs or honey mixtures. Others were disturbing. Powdered animal organs, ground insects, even potions laced with hallucinogens. Roman writers describe women slipping such concoctions into husbands' food to increase passion, or to enslave their desire entirely. Manuals of love circulated in secret, describing techniques in shocking detail. Some were translations of Greek works, others original Roman creations. They turned intimacy into a science, cataloging positions, tricks, and psychological games. To some Romans, sex wasn't merely pleasure. It was conquest by other means, a battlefield of dominance and surrender. Yet with novelty came excess. Some nobles grew bored with conventional partners, turning instead to strange practices. Role-playing as gods, reenacting mythological seductions, or demanding humiliating acts from slaves for amusement. For them, desire was not about connection. It was about spectacle, about pushing boundaries further and further until nothing was left untouched. Exotic pleasures reveal a truth about Rome, that an empire which conquered half the world also sought to conquer the limits of human experience. Driven by curiosity, arrogance, and hunger that knew no end. Among all the excesses of Rome, none captured its madness more than the infamous Emperor Caligula and his floating palaces. Historical accounts describe massive ships, not built for war or travel, but for pleasure. They were adorned with marble floors, golden roofs, and gardens that bloomed upon the water. But their true purpose was decadence. These ships were floating orgy palaces, drifting across Lake Nemi as Caligula indulged in fantasies beyond imagination. On deck, feasts stretched for days, wine spilling into the lake as slaves and courtesans entertained guests. Music and laughter echoed across the waters, but beneath it all, the nights descended into scenes of unrestrained lust. Caligula selected partners on a whim, men, women, even married nobles, forcing them into acts before the watching crowd. For Caligula, this was not just pleasure. It was theater, a demonstration of his absolute power. By desecrating the sanctity of marriage, humiliating senators, and mocking the gods through sexual parodies, he proved that no law, divine or human, could restrain him. The ships themselves were marvels of engineering, with plumbing systems, baths, and rotating platforms for elaborate performances. Archaeologists in the 20th century recovered remains of these vessels, confirming that such decadent floating palaces were real, not just rumor. Imagine the sight: torches blazing across the water, music drifting on the night air, while the Emperor of Rome, surrounded by gold and silk, turned the surface of the lake into his private stage of desire. Caligula's ships stand as the ultimate symbol of Rome's strange sexual world, where power and lust merged until they were indistinguishable, and where even the calm waters of a lake became witness to the empire's darkest appetites. The Roman Empire was not just an empire of soldiers and senators, it was an empire of desire, where sexuality shaped politics, religion, and power. From temples of sacred prostitution to Caligula's floating orgies, Rome reveals a world both fascinating and horrifying. Which of these practices shocked you the most? Tell us in the comments. And don't forget, this is Royal Conspiracies, your window into the darkest secrets of history. Subscribe now because the past still holds stories too strange to believe.